Novklibber, hi friends, Darth Momo here, and today I want to debunk something I see thrown around often by Star Wars EU fans or people who don't like the new Star Wars canon. It is often claimed that Dave Filoni recklessly retconned a lot of EU, Expanded Universe, ideas with the Clone Wars series, and a lot of these fans go as far as to claim that true Star Wars is 1 through 6 in the old EU. And I'm sorry, but that's factually wrong. Look, if you like the old EU more than the Clone Wars or the Disney canon, that's completely fine. And if you think Dave Filoni has a retconning problem, that is also fine. I actually agree with that. But to claim Dave was the one stepping over quote-unquote true fans and retconning the old EU left and right, or to claim that the Clone Wars is not true Star Wars, is far from the truth. Let's break it down. Let's start with the often circulated claim that the Clone Wars is Dave's show. This is flat out false. Yes, Dave was heavily involved in overseeing the day-to-day production of the show, such as lighting, animating, voice recordings, music, etc. But George had to sign off on and approve everything. And when it came to story meetings and the basic ideas and stories of the show, that was all George. Yes, oftentimes episodes were scripted by someone other than Dave or George, but they oversaw all of it together. Let's tackle a couple of the larger claims. Perhaps the most criticized idea by EU fans was Ahsoka Tano, and the idea that Anakin had a Padawan. Originally, the show was going to be about new characters similar to the Ghost Crew, but George reorganized the whole thing to feature the main film characters. Regarding Ahsoka, Dave wanted to make her Obi-Wan's new Padawan, to which George said, nah, she's going to be Anakin's Padawan. Dave agreed with the fans and said, George, Anakin doesn't have a Padawan. And George responded, Anakin has a Padawan. Another instance was in Season 2, when the entire culture of Mandalore was changed to be a mainstream pacifist society instead of tribal warriors. This was George's idea, not Dave's, and it was George who said Jango and Boba Fett were not Mandalorians, something Dave has sort of retconned with the Mandoverse. Again, this was from George, not Dave. Dave is once again trying to align with the EU. Perhaps another idea that is criticized and very well known is the resurrection of Darth Maul. This was once again George's idea that Dave tried to fight George on. George asked Dave to bring Maul back. Dave said, but George, Maul is dead. And George said, well, figure it out. There are so many examples, from the Zillo Beast to D-Squad in Season 5 to the Inhibitor chips. They all originate with George. A lot of the EU elements brought into the show, such as Black Sun, were Dave's ideas, not George. Dave was the one who looked for ways to insert Legends material into the show. A lot of people seem to forget this, but Dave is a fan. He loves the old Legends stories. He's adapting Heir to the Empire with the Mandoverse. He slips in KOTOR references into the shows when possible. But Dave merely worked for the creator. Clone Wars was always George's baby. And as much as I love Dave's work on Star Wars, I think it is pretty obvious when you look at his work since, such as Rebels, Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and you compare that to the Clone Wars, I think it's pretty obvious that Clone Wars was the one that had the George Lucas touch to it. Also, some people will claim that Dave, and by extension George, nerfed characters like General Grievous. But I would say they didn't nerf anyone. He merely nerfed the Legends interpretation of the character. Grievous of the Clone Wars, for example, is very much in line with Grievous in Revenge of the Sith. And I would say that principle applies to anyone else that thinks that a character or an element was nerfed or changed from what the EU says. But moving on to the second point, the EU was never George's true Star Wars, whereas Clone Wars was from day one. I think there's often a lot of misunderstood ideas on George's true thoughts on the EU. He didn't outright hate it like some people claimed. He often knew the basics of what was going on in the stories, and there was lots of the stories he actually really liked. That being said, he always established that the EU was not his, he would have done things differently, and he had the right to overturn any decision with his own material should he feel the need to. Clone Wars was as much George's work as the first 6 films were. If you want to dislike the retcons Clone Wars brought to the old EU, that's fine. But to claim that George and Dave were wrong to do so is completely false. And to claim that this is a new issue, or that it's exclusive to George's stuff, is also wrong. The prequel era retcons several things out of the EU. The prequels were only alluded to and never outright covered by the old EU, so the retcons weren't as drastic as the Clone Wars era, but there were many retcons. Originally, the EU stated the Clone Wars were much earlier. The Jedi served the Empire briefly, and the clones were the bad guys. And Boba's origin story was completely different. And the old EU had lots of retcons as well, such as the Death Star plans get stolen multiple times, the shuttle in Return of the Jedi gets stolen twice, lots of stories are told in different ways, and prequel EU stories had to adjust the old EU stories to fit with the new films. There was lots of information presented here in this video, too much to source and to quote in the video if I wanted to keep the runtime down, but please, feel free to fact check me on this and research what I've said. And you'll start to see that a lot of the statements made by old EU fans about George, the Clone Wars, the old EU, and Dave Filoni are misinformation and outright lies to try and slam the new Disney canon in Filoni's animated shows. Yes, you are free to like what you like and dislike what you dislike. I'm not arguing against that. But don't spread lies just because you don't like something, because no matter how much you like the old EU, the truth is it has just as many retcons and issues within itself as the new canon does, and that the Clone Wars is just as much true George Lucas Star Wars as the original 6 films were. Thank you for joining in, and may the Force be with you. Always. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them delight.